China's Premier Li Qiang visits Malaysia. It's the last leg of a three-nation tour. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Chinese Premier Li Qiang is on a major three-nation tour that has taken him to New Zealand, Australia and now Malaysia. Improving diplomatic relations and developing economic ties are high on the agenda. We begin with this report from CGTN's Ryan Meltzer in Kuala Lumpur.
For Malaysia, this was a long-anticipated visit by a Chinese leader, given that this year marks the 50th anniversary of China-Malaysia diplomatic ties. Chinese Premier Li Qiang held bilateral talks with top Malaysian officials, as well as one-on-one with Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. The two leaders also oversaw the signing of a slew of MOUs to strengthen cooperation in areas including digital economy, green development, higher education, science and technology, and the export of agricultural commodities to China.
Reiterate again the need to express my profound appreciation to this visit, which we'll consider a major visit, an important milestone in the working relations between Malaysia and China.
On Wednesday, Premier Li and Prime Minister Anwar took part in a ceremonial groundbreaking for what will be a key station on the 665-kilometer-long East Coast rail link. China Communications Construction Company is building the rail link and will jointly operate the $10 billion railway linking the prosperous West Coast to the underdeveloped East by the end of 2026. Malaysia was among the first countries to enthusiastically get on board with the Belt and Road Initiative, and the East Coast rail link is the standout result of that decision.
China-Malaysia friendship is just like this long railroad track, which crosses the mountains and seas and has a promising future. Let's grasp the historical opportunity, implement the existing projects well, and continuously expand new areas of cooperation.
After spending the day laying out a path for strengthening China-Malaysia collaboration for the decades ahead, Premier Li and Prime Minister Anwar attended a dinner to celebrate the milestone of the 50th anniversary of their country's diplomatic ties. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Kuala Lumpur.
And now for much more on all of this, joining me from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is Chair Professor at Soochow University. Also with us from Kuala Lumpur is Majid. He is a professor at the University of Malaya. And joining us too from Sydney is James Laurenceson. He is director of the Australia-China Relations Institute. Welcome to all of you. Victor Gao, let me start with you. Premier Li Qiang said on his three-nation tour, so before his visit to Malaysia, he visited Australia and New Zealand. So looking at this diplomatic outreach by the Chinese Premier, how would you sort of assess these ties?
Let me focus on China-Australian relations first. For about 7 years, China-Australian relations deteriorated, and Australia seems to be in a very difficult situation of whether it wants to tilt completely to the United States or maintain a healthy, constructive economic relations with China. After all, China is the largest trading nation for Australia. I think under the new Prime Minister, Australia is restoring back to normalcy. It wants to keep its strong political and military alliance with the United States, which is not a problem as far as China is concerned. But also Australia wants to go to the hilt in developing economic and trading relations and people-to-people exchanges with China. I think this is the right thing to do. Australia should not just develop political relations with the United States at the expense of economic relations with China, or vice versa. This will make Australia a greater nation and will make China-Australia relations better and for mutual benefit. And I hope this normalized China-Australia relations will set a good example for other developed countries For example, I just came back from Brussels, and I talked to the EU leaders and Belgian leaders about the same thing. We should learn from this normalization of relations between China and Australia and do our best to promote mutually beneficial relations between China and other developed countries. New Zealand has always been a very constructive example of developing normal relations with China. And this time, Premier Li Qiang's visit really elevates China-New Zealand relations to a greater height. And I hope China-New Zealand economic and trading relations will generate greater benefits for the New Zealand people as well as for the Chinese people. Let me be very brief about China-Malaysia relations. I was in Malaysia about 1 week ago, and I really felt that both China and Malaysia really wanted to do the best thing, not only to celebrate the 50th year of normalization of relations between China and Malaysia, but also to put more and more meat and substance to China-Malaysia cooperations. There are so many projects that can be done for the mutual benefit, and I'm so glad to see Premier Li Qiang and Prime Minister Anwar and the two governments put their ink to the very important cooperations. And I do believe Malaysia will become one of the most important ASEAN member states to spearhead good, mutually constructive relations between China and ASEAN member states.
Majid Khan, great to have you with us, sir. Now, this year marks the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and Malaysia, and both Premier Li and Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, they want to strengthen the bilateral ties that exist between these two countries. How important is this visit for the China-Malaysia relationship?
As we know that Malaysia and China has a very long-standing traditional ties of friendship, cultural and trade. So this visit, Premier Li Qiang, though brief, I would consider very impactful in three aspects. First, it reaffirms both sides to further consolidate the existing good relations, and particularly is reflected in the consolidation and deepening of economic linkages. Malaysia and China enjoys strong economic linkages in terms of trade and investment. And thirdly, I think as Victor mentioned, both countries have put meat to the contents of the relation so that it's meaningful to continue the cooperation in the years to come. Basically in the areas that which Malaysia's need in terms of technology transfer, in terms of high-level manufacturing, digitalization, and of course transition to green energy, which Chinese are strong. We also found that Chinese experiences in question of housing, urban planning, and also question of export experience. This is something that Malaysia would like to further cooperate with China.
And now also joining our discussion is John Gong. He is professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing and a China Forum expert. John, great to see you as well. Now, these two leaders signed agreements that will strengthen cooperation in some very specific areas, and these areas are digital economy, green development, science and technology, and agriculture. So how would you characterize the relationship between China and Malaysia?
Well, I think both countries' cooperation and relationship has been developing, and probably Malaysia is one of the most important countries to China among the ASEAN club. Both countries, we don't have any fundamental conflicts of interest. Economies are fairly complementary towards each other. China's Belt and Road Initiative has seen quite a few projects, especially on the east coast of Malaysia, that ways to be developed and industrialized. I think in all aspects, the relationship has been developing quite well. Especially, I would mention Prime Minister Anwar's position and attitudes towards China. We've been, he has been a great leader of Malaysia, and I think. In addition to the sort of the business and economic relationships, he's also been quite instrumental in spearheading a sort of a cultural exchanges, people-to-people exchanges. For example, a few months ago, I attended an event which he spearheaded and you know, embraced very much about the Islam and Confucius dialogue, for example. You know, these are the two major faiths, respectively, for the two countries, and how Islamic culture and Confucius culture can coexist and cooperate on world affairs and in the region. You know, these initiatives, I would argue, that contribute to, you know, a more solid foundation for the two countries. And I think on a range of global issues and matters, China and Malaysia have been pretty much on the same side. For example, you know, in recent years, you know, the position with respect to the two conflicts, respectively in Middle East, in Europe, you know, both countries, you know, pretty much have the same opinion. So I think, you know, a very healthy relationship between the two countries, trade and investment being thriving. I think China-Malaysia's relationship is probably the best ever since you know, both countries have established diplomatic relations.
James Laurenceson, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. Premier Li also made a 4-day visit, a state visit to Australia, where he met with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Here is some of what the two leaders had to say. Let's listen.
The resumption of this roundtable is yet another encouraging sign of the stabilisation of the relationship between our two great nations. It reflects a commitment to dialogue that Australia and China can use to manage our different views and advance our common interests.
Both of our countries have explored areas such as artificial intelligence, quantum science and technology, bioscience, and have accumulated experience. We should strengthen planning and strategic alignment and jointly cultivate potential growth points in China-Australia cooperation.
So, James, both leaders agreed to expand China-Australia engagement and dialogue. How do you see the relationship right now and where it goes to from here?
Yeah, look, I think it's in a pretty healthy place after a very rocky few years. What Premier Li Qiang's visit really confirms is that there's been a full restoration of two-way dialogue at the highest political levels. Now, that's obviously the level you want these issues to be discussed at. When you have the two leaders saying the same thing, it sends a very powerful signal to the bureaucracies in both countries, as well as non-state actors involved in the relationship, such as businesses and households. I'm pleased to see that both leaders are returning to a diplomatic formula that served Australia and China very well since diplomatic ties were established in 1972, and that is that both sides recognise the differences but agree to manage those differences calmly and professionally, and agree that those differences should not define the relationship. There was a bit of walking back from that diplomatic formula a few years ago, but I think we're back on track now.
Victor Gar, there have been some strains in the China-Australia relationship in recent years, but this visit seems designed to get relations back on track. You know, both leaders stressed the mutual benefits that accrue to both countries from more cordial ties. But looking at how this relationship is progressing right now, what does it mean for the region?
Well, first of all, for the normalized relations between China and Australia as a result of this very important visit to Australia by Chinese Premier Li Qiang, we need to fully acknowledge that this normalization is very much based on realism and pragmatism. And China is happy for Australia to continue its good political military relations with the United States on the one hand, but also China and Australia promote our economic and trading relations. After all, China is the largest trading partner for Australia. In China, we have lots of people who want to study in Australia, do tourism in Australia, buy properties in Australia. People-to-people exchanges cannot be more important for China and Australia. I think this level of pragmatism and realism will be very important, not only for China and Australia, but for China and all the other developed countries around the world, and more particularly to countries in the South Pacific region as a whole. Because no country should really indulge in the fantasy that if they want to develop better relations with the United States, they need to abandon their economic and trading and people-to-people exchanges with China. That's a recipe for disaster. I think we need to be realistic. We need to acknowledge that China is the largest economy if we use purchasing power parity, and China has the largest consumption market in the world, and China is pushing forward in almost all areas of science and technological breakthroughs, and the future for the Chinese economic development will be even more substance and generating even greater benefits for all countries in the world which care to develop closer economic ties with China. This hope, I hope, will be the spirit of this normalization of relations between China and Australia. And this will also herald in a new era where countries in the world will not worry about engaging with China, and they will be completely at ease to develop economic and trading relations and people-to-people exchanges with China, while they decide to continue their political and economic and other relations with another big country. It's not either or. The real choice is whatever that will serve your fundamental interest of your own people. That will be the choice for that country. And apparently, Australia has made the right choice, and I hope other countries will follow suit.
John, Gong, business was very high on the agenda in Australia, and Premier Li underlined the importance of expanding cooperation in things like renewable energy and EV technology as well. How do you see this?
Well, I think the relationship between China and Australia is more about business than anything else. And I think Victor is right that it's the political relationship between the United States and Australia somewhat stands in the way for the relationship between China and Australia. I think it depends on what that Australia-American relationship is intended to do. I don't have a problem at all that these two countries, they're very close allies for many years. They fought together during the Second World War, for example. They're getting very close. That's all understandable. But I think it shouldn't be standing in the way. Doing things that's contrary to China's interests, particularly with respect to the alliance increasingly encroaching in, for example, in South China Sea, related matters. These are the things that stand in the way, I think. And also, looking back, I think a lot has to do with the Morrison administration's unprovoked intention of exploring the origins of COVID, things like that. I mean, this is totally unnecessary in my view. And I think the relationship between China and Australia fundamentally shouldn't have any conflicts of interest at all. I mean, we are thousands of miles apart, and why should we be butting our heads for things totally unrelated to our own interests? And besides, the two countries' economies are very complementary towards each other. Australia is a very large, resource-rich and resource exporting country, whereas China is a manufacturing powerhouse. Both countries can be cooperating on a range of issues. I think it is the new Albanese administration's sort of more realistic, as well as more practical attitudes that's sort of resuming the current relationship, and I'm hoping that on a range of issues both sides can be more cooperative. Premier Li mentioned, for example, these high-tech areas for potential cooperation. To be honest with you, I'm a little bit skeptical actually, because some of these things regard the national security aspects from Australia's perspective. Certainly, we would welcome potential cooperation opportunities, but that has to be hinged upon Australia's position that these things should be treated not so much in danger of the national security from their perspective.
Majid Khan, Malaysia was one of the first countries to embrace the Belt and Road Initiative, China's Belt and Road Initiative. China is in fact now building that railway, as we saw in our report at the beginning of the program, building that railway, which will connect the west in Malaysia to the east, the west of course being more prosperous than the east. What kind of impact will that have?
I think the East Coast Railway line will be a game changer in Malaysia. First, as you mentioned, the development of the east coast of Peninsular Malaysia. Secondly, a land bridge to the west coast of Malaysia, the ports. So the ports of Kuantan and the west coast will be linked together. And another significant factor will be the connectivity with China. The port in Kuantan will be linked actually to ports in southern China. And last evening during the dinner, Prime Minister Anwar mentioned about the possibility of extending the linkage, the industrial parks in Kuantan to also in East Coast in Kuching. So this also will actually create reasons for better sea connectivity between the East Coast of Malaysia to to the east of Malaysia and henceforth to southern China's ports.
James Laurenceson, the Australian Prime Minister Albanese, he also outlined a number of areas where he sees the potential for an improvement in the relationship. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
We share economic complementarities and face many shared challenges that we are well placed to work together on, including, of course, addressing the challenge but also the opportunities that are arising from climate change. I warmly welcome the resumption of the people-to-people connections that have long been a lasting bridge between our two countries.
So, James, we heard the Prime Minister there talk about climate change as well as people-to-people exchanges, but where do you see the potential for an improvement in relations?
Oh, look, it is hard to get away from that area of climate change. You know, just over the last few years, this is trade in, for example, Australia now exports about $20 billion worth of largely unprocessed lithium to China. And in return, we're importing thousands and thousands of electric vehicles manufactured in China. Now, this is a trade that 5 years ago hardly existed. So when I look at the broader sweep or the longer sweep history of Australia-China economic relations, what I see is the complementarities between the two economies just continuing to expand. It really is hard for me to identify two other countries that are more complementary in the economic realm. You know, even when political ties several years ago were at their lowest ebb since diplomatic relations between Canberra and Beijing were established, if you look at the two-way trade numbers, in aggregate at least, they continued to increase. So look, this has been a strong economic relationship, and I don't see it becoming any less significant in the future.
Victor, how do you see Premier Li's visit to Malaysia contributing to China-ASEAN, the free trade area there?
Definitely. I think China and ASEAN should really talk about their free trade agreement 2.0 to really upgrade the existing free trade agreement, because both ASEAN member states and China have made huge progress, especially in terms of science and technology and in many areas. And I think their free trade agreement need to reflect the new dynamics. And China is really pushing forward in a very, very vigorous way to the forefront of many areas of science and technology. And I hope the free trade agreement, the new version, will accommodate all these cooperations. From the Chinese perspective, China is perfectly happy and willing to share its technologies and know-how with Malaysia and other ASEAN member states. And I hope China actually wants to show that for any of the 10 ASEAN member states, so long as China, their relations can be mutually beneficial based on full respect and free from third-party intervention or instigation, for example, then it will be mutually beneficial for both China and that cooperating country. And this will really generate better results for one single member of the ASEAN countries, which doesn't seem to be happy in engaging with China as an equal and promoting what really matters for that country. That is the economic and trading relations for the greater benefit of its people. So I think Malaysia will be a good example, and all the other ASEAN member states will embrace this rare opportunity of more comprehensive cooperation with China and set a good example for that single other ASEAN member state to do the better things.
John Gong, let's talk about Premier Li's visit to New Zealand. In fact, this visit marked the 10th anniversary of the China-New Zealand Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. It looks like we're now going to see even more economic cooperation. How do you see it?
Yeah, well, I think earlier Victor mentioned that New Zealand is very different from other American airlines in the region and also in Europe. I think New Zealand is a very good example of how an important country in the quote, Western Bloc can maintain its relationship with China, setting aside some differences. I won't say a lot of differences, but there's some differences, I guess, in the political realm. But on the economic front, both sides work closely. Trade has been thriving between New Zealand and China. It's a very good example how the two countries with probably different political systems can coexist and cooperate. I think there's also another issue that needs to be mentioned. That is respect to China's relationship with the South Pacific countries. Yeah. On this matter, New Zealand doesn't seem to take a position, whereas Australia is somewhat opposed, I guess, regarding that area as the backyard of Canberra. But that's a thorny issue, I guess. Both sides have to be working out. But ultimately, I think, China's relationship with these island countries brings, prosperity to those people as well as dignity, in my view. These countries. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, actually, John, I was going to interrupt you there because we have run out of time. We've come to the end of the show. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.